Hi, I'm Deepak Anand, CEO and co-founder of Materia Ventures, and you're listening to Professionally Cannabis.
Where do they go, the smoke rings I blow each night? Oh, what do they do, those circles of blue and white?
Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Professionally Cannabis. Oscar, tell us about the guest we have today.
Well, our guest today is Deepak Anand. He's the CEO and co-founder of Materia Ventures, a European-focused CBD and cannabis company. And he comes with a wide range of views and opinions. He's been in this space for a long time, Jonathan, and he's been talking to a lot of people before us, unfortunately.
Absolutely right. And on that, he is a bit of a talking head in the industry with a really large social following across most of the platforms. He's a pretty well-known guy in the space.
Yeah. I actually feel a little bit false making this introduction because I'm sure most of the people listening to this episode will have been introduced because they know Deepak and not us. But let's hope they love the show.
Well, without further ado, let's get to it.
Oh, what do they do, those circles of blue and white?
I'm delighted to welcome to the podcast Deepak Anand, CEO and co-founder of Materia Ventures, a Canadian-based cannabis company. With a social following bigger than many companies and sitting on a number of boards across the cannabis value chain, I think it's fair to say you hold a decent amount of influence in this space. What do you reckon, Deepak?
Well, thanks for having me, Jonathan. I've certainly been fortunate to have a place in the global cannabis industry and one that I am constantly learning from. And I'm excited to be here with you today.
Great. So let's start with our favorite early question. And I think about how it pertains to Europe in this case is pretty interesting. But what led you to the plant, Deepak?
That's a great question. So I got into this industry just over 6 years ago now. I come from a pharmaceutical background, and so I was very skeptical, I should say, of cannabis at the outset. And what led me to the plant really was a number of people that I was speaking to on a daily basis that were using cannabis either for their own or for their, in this case, children's medical conditions. So it involved me interacting a lot with moms that had kids on epilepsy and, that were suffering significantly and saw tremendous miracles that this plant had sort of served to them. And so as I was speaking to them through this process of understanding what cannabis can do, it really sort of piqued my curiosity, and even beyond that, just solidified in my mind this was something very serious, and that the plant has significant benefits.
Great. I think skepticism is a really interesting place to start when it comes to cannabis, especially here in Europe, where education about the medicinal benefits aren't so widely known. Do you have a go-to way to make skeptics believers? How do you take people through that journey?
If you speak to, people like Charlotte Caldwell, the mother of Billy Caldwell, who have sort of firsthand seen, the benefits that the cannabis plant has provided to their children, or it'd be, Mandy McKnight, who's another mother here in Canada that has gone through the same process, or the hundreds of other mothers, across North America and really the world that are seeing firsthand the benefits of the cannabis plant and what it can do to them and what it has done to them and their children in terms of the quality of life, as well as directly sort of their children benefiting from the outcomes of this medicine. You can't really argue with that from a perspective that there is some therapeutic property, there is some therapeutic use here. It goes beyond anecdotal evidence in proving that there is clearly something to be said here, the fact that people are willing to go to jail over trying to access this medicine. And I think that warrants further research and further sort of, educational awareness of what the plant can do.
And on that education piece, could you tell us a little bit more about Materia Ventures, the organization, what you guys do? And then I guess dovetailing into that, what role you see yourself in the industry as an organization in terms of educating those in the industry and, of course, outside the industry as well?
Absolutely. So Materia Ventures is a European-focused CBD and medical cannabis supply and distribution business. On the education side, we're quite involved with physicians on all sides of the pond to be able to look at what's happened in Canada. Just by way of background, we've had 300,000 patients in Canada over that amount that have been accessing cannabis for medical purposes for quite some time without any serious outcomes or negative side effects or harms from that use. And so we want to be able to take this evidence that's out there that patients have gone through and physicians have been sort of, comfortable prescribing and bring this awareness to the rest of the world, predominantly Europe, where today we're seeing, one side of sort of the population talk about research and the need for more clinical research, whereas the other side is sort of, we can't wait. This is something that we must access immediately. So we'd like to be able to bridge that gap, which is a fine balance between anecdotal information as well as clinical research. And so whilst we may want to get to clinical research, and that's certainly something that we at Materia Ventures believe in, we understand that there are immediate needs that need to be solved, and there is a pathway towards getting there. So we'd like to be able to bring all of this knowledge and learning and education and information that has occurred in Canada predominantly in a federally regulated way, mind you, to other countries in the world. When I look at the Australian model and I look at the significant challenges patients have had over the past 4 years that they've had a legal system, it's absolutely appalling that they haven't considered, what Canada's been through. And the UK, to some extent, seems to be going down that path. And what we'd like to first and foremost do is ensure that patients don't need to suffer as a result of protectionist measures that governments might put in place because they're just not comfortable. The idea is to really look at, say, we've done this in Canada. We've had over 300,000 patients that are currently accessing this medicine without significant outcomes. So let's start from there. Let's learn from some of the mistakes that Canada's made, but also look at some of the sort of things that they've done positively on the medical side, and then proceed from there.
And you mentioned that, a core part of the business is both on the production and distribution side. What products do you currently sell or are looking to be distributing into the wider market?
So we're very much focused on medical cannabis products. Products contain so far THC and CBD, the products that are being sold in a regulated pathway. So they're more medical cannabis products. I mean, we're still conducting research on the hundreds of other cannabinoids that the plant has, but so far it's been a balance of both THC and CBD as well as one-to-one products that are commonly available in the European market now that patients are comfortable with using and physicians are more comfortable with prescribing. So it's certainly medical cannabis products.
Can you go into the form factor at all?
Absolutely. So we strongly believe that, smoking is probably not the best way that you want to be going about doing this. We've seen countries like the UK completely oppose smoking. Physicians are not comfortable with prescribing anything to their patients that involve smoking. So we've been focusing on the oils as well as further down into the soft gels and the tablets and tinctures and transdermal patches and lotions. So we're focusing on products that are more oil driven or oil derived versus the flower side of things, which, if you look at what's happening globally, I think that's a dying breed. There's certainly going to be a connoisseur flower market, but on the medical side, we're very much moving towards oil and oil derivatives like capsules and tinctures and creams and lotions, etc.
Well, I find transdermal very interesting, partly because I once found a black market product that my grandma found great for neuropathic pain, but it's difficult to find such things in the legitimate market, and certainly I don't see prescriptions happening for them anytime soon in the UK. Are you looking to bring, I'd assume transdermal products would be probably further down the line for you. Is that anything that you can talk about, or is it under wraps?
Well, I mean, what I can say is that we're, absolutely under the clinical phase of looking at research around those different products. It's something that we've thought about quite significantly. You're absolutely right. There aren't many products available. Even products that might be available may not be what they're quite supposed to be. But, that's an area that we've identified as a massive gap. And it's something that we want to go down the path of doing. And I would say that we're on the path of doing, those are all, pharmaceutical delivery systems that patients could significantly benefit from. And so we're currently underway in terms of research and sort of down the path of trying to formulate some of those products.
And you mentioned that Europe is a key market and perhaps the key market for Materia Ventures. With regards to your Maltese and Danish operations, are these joint ventures, acquisitions, or totally self-developed?
So the Maltese operation is entirely self-dependent. It's an asset that's owned by us 100%. We feel very strongly about the Maltese market. The government has been very supportive to working with us on that side of things. And when I say the Maltese market, I actually mean the European market, because Malta in itself, doesn't have a significant number of patients on the medical cannabis side. But the intention is to be able to set up a strong foundation out of Malta for distribution into the rest of Europe. As far as our UK assets are concerned, again, that would be something that we have on our own. The Danish one is a partnership with a Danish group that has already been sort of operational and on the ground there and has a number of contacts in place, and so that's a JV partnership. But the other two are us on our own.
And what do you look for in the companies that you enter joint venture agreements with? Sort of what do they need to show you to prove their worth as someone that Materia should partner with?
So with Europe, one of the things that we look at for partnerships is you have to look at Europe as a single market. You can't look at it as an isolated market, whether it be the UK or Malta or Germany or Denmark. We look at partners that have significant experience on the patient side or the clinical side, whether it be pharmacies, pharmaceutical wholesale distributors, or people that understand what that landscape looks like. Those are people and companies that we're interested in talking to, and those are partners that we want to have. In addition to that, we're looking at people that are looking at this from a long-term perspective. Whilst today cannabis could be unlicensed medicine and it's categorized as such, what we want to eventually be able to get to is something called a marketing authorization, which, comes first into clinical trials. It's that stuff that we were talking about on the transdermal PAT side, on the oil side. It's basically medicine and looked at as medicine. And that's our eventual goal, is to be able to launch products that conduct marketing authorizations and have marketing authorizations so that they can be sold and doctors can be comfortable prescribing these products. And it's not this gray area just solely based on anecdotal evidence that's out there.
To take it sort of still relevant to the European question, but also about your team composition, I think everyone listening to this will probably recognize you from Twitter. You're quite a big presence in the cannabis sphere. And as Materia Ventures had another joinee a month ago, I believe I saw a tweet that said, Deepak is forming the Avengers of Cannabis. So in a similar vein to the question about who you look for as a JV partner, who do you look for as a team member of Materia Ventures? And how many of them are European or European based?
That's a great question. So, yes, I did see that analogy on Twitter about the Avengers of Cannabis. To answer your question, we're a small team. So far, we're only about 8 people. We've got about 6 people out of that team that are already European based, either from Europe that have worked in Canada or are European based and live there. So a significant chunk of our team is already on that side of the pond, if you will. What we look for is people that bring a unique skill set that sort of buy into our vision in terms of being in it for the long term, but also have proved themselves in the cannabis industry to a certain extent. When we look at hiring people on this side of the pond, is people that have had a track record of working for companies within the cannabis sector that have done quite well, whether it be our recent hires from companies on the software side, or whether it be recent hires from licensed producers in Canada. Those are people that we know can deliver and have delivered in the past, and we'll be able to take this and understand the cannabis side of things and execute on the vision. And as for that side of the pond, again, it's similar to our partners, as people that have been in the pharmaceutical space and understand pharmaceutical logistics, whether it be supply and distribution, whether it be manufacturing, or whether it be research and development.
And so you straddle the pond in terms of your team and your market. How do you feel that the European market's going to differ from the Canadian market?
Europe is very pharmaceutically focused as far as the medical cannabis conversation goes. And in Canada, it started off that way. And then somewhere along the path, everyone got engulfed in this recreational conversation, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just a different space into which cannabis has gone. Unfortunately, when I look at this from a Canadian perspective, we haven't done the best job or a good job on looking at cannabis from a medical perspective. And I think that's where Europe is going to do a much better job, whether it be on the research side through clinical trials. And there's, certainly a number of trials underway across Europe and by European companies around the world, or whether it be on the product formulation side. We've seen predominantly in the Canadian market flower and oils as being products that are available. We've only recently seen gel caps, which are quasi-medical, but certainly being used in the nutraceutical/recreational market. But Europe, on the other hand, is going to demand pharmaceutical formulations and products that look like pharmaceutical products, whether it be capsules, whether it be gel caps, whether it be transdermal patches, whether it be lotions, whether it be any of the pharmaceutical products that you're used to. I think Europe is going to demand that the cannabis industry manufacture those products, and that's what's going to be successful about the European market. Is it's going to be very medically focused, and it's going to be a significant market in terms of market size and patient numbers as compared to Canada. We're seeing this in the U.S. to a certain extent, but unfortunately, because of the federal prohibition in the U.S., there hasn't been sort of this federally legal movement towards formulating of these products. I think what you're seeing today, actually, with the FDA hearings is an intent to perhaps go down that path. But I see Europe eclipsing the United States when it comes to that. And certainly, if we can take what we've done in Canada and bring it forward and use that experience and knowledge to leverage ourselves and sort of the experience that we've had in the European market, then that would be sort of a recipe for success.
And I think the comparisons there with the US are particularly pertinent, especially as you look at the Europe as a whole, as a continent. There are, stark comparisons with the US in the sense that each country, like each state, has their own complex regulatory system, but there is also an overarching European-wide, as there is federally-wide, regulations and rules in place. How do you guys, as a business, navigate those, the array of complex regulations in Europe? And what do you think European regulators can learn?
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest things that the US has actually going against it is the fact that you haven't seen any federal government involvement on this, whether it be the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, which is the FDA that regulates pharmaceutical products, or whether it be the DEA that sort of enforces regulations, or whether it be different arms of the U.S. government at a federal level that have typically been involved in pharmaceutical sort of development of regulations and laws. And I think, when you look at this from a European perspective, states don't have, paramountcy as far as legality is concerned. So from a Canadian perspective, I think there's a lot of learning to be had actually by European countries, because they're looking at this very much on a federal basis. There are things like, treaties that are signed by the United Nations that all of the member states in Europe are signatory to, that you need to look and understand and appreciate. And I can tell you that, having looked at the Canadian model very, very closely and been in it, those are quite important conversations to have. And countries are very concerned from an international perspective that they are not offside on any regulations and laws. And so, U.S. states don't necessarily have that concern. They've only had to sort of worry about what's happening within their borders without this overarching theme of let's look at the outside world and what impact does this have on the outside world. And I think Canada's done a phenomenal job there of understanding and appreciating, how does this impact people outside of our borders, whether it be people that might be looking to import medical cannabis, of which there's certainly a lot happening at the moment, or whether it be our international partners as far as our treaties are concerned. And whilst we may be in violation of some of these treaties, we're still able to navigate our ways around a compliant fashion under which we do this and a responsible fashion under which we do this. And I think that's a significant learning that regulators in Europe can have.
With regards to your expansion in Europe, are you guys at Materia solely focusing on the medical market, or are you preempting any future changes in legislation that would ready yourself and your product range for a potential recreational market, or at least some potential recreational markets?
So Materia is very much focused on the medical market. We believe in medical, sort of the benefits of medical cannabis, as well as that whole side really taking off in Europe. Having said that, we're very open to the nutraceutical, sort of, natural health product side of things, still within the pharmaceutical element, if you will. We're not getting into cookies and brownies and gummy bears and, things of that nature. That's not of interest to us, and that's not an area that we're focusing on.
So let's look at the distinctions in your business line then, because for some of us, or for some businesses rather, the CBD side of things can look a little like that recreational mark. So CBD gummies are pretty popular in the UK already, and CBD flower is available on the continent, probably as a partly therapeutic device, but also some people seem to use it recreationally. Does your CBD side of the business take a strong stance on the branding and the positioning of your products in that regard?
So yeah, look, on the CBD side, you're absolutely right. There are a number of things that are currently happening in the European market, whether it be, UK high streets are flooded with CBD products, or whether it be Christmas markets in places like Vienna or Germany that, CBD flower is sold at very commonly, and Italy is very similar as well. What's happening today is not necessarily what is going to happen in the market in the long term, whether it be the novel food regulations or whether it be the food safety agencies that are the regulators of this, have certainly woken up to the fact that there is a lot happening within their borders that they ought to regulate, and they are going to change. So, I think you will see some of the products that are currently available on shelves be pulled back, and at a minimum, you're going to see some responsible labeling and advertising guidelines being put into place. And we at Materia sort of strongly believe in forecasting for that change to come and ensuring that any products that we put on the market or help our partners put into the market are going to be compliant with those regulations, whether it be on the labeling side, whether it be on the advertising side, or whether, quite frankly, just be responsible consumption. When you look at things like candies and gummies, those are not entirely sort of safe consumption methods. Certainly the way that we're being done currently in that market, it's very unregulated and isn't going to stay that way in the long term. So will there perhaps be CBD gummies that are regulated and compliant? The answer is yes, but I think it's going to take some time for the regulator to acknowledge and give their blessings onto a product like that. And, we'll want to make sure that anything that we put on the market is well ahead of anything that a regulator might look at approving, and at a minimum would be at ease and would be of comfort to the regulator when we put it out.
So no Materia Ventures CBD flower anytime soon?
Unfortunately not.
And something you touched on there was labeling. Now, how important do you think it is for CBD products and indeed THC products to have the full cannabinoid content listed out in the labelings that aren't just exclusive to how much THC or CBD is in the product?
Look, I think it's incredibly important. I mean, if you look at the report that we released at the Center for Medical Cannabis recently, that was a key area for focus was, some of the products that are on the market are either improperly labeled or whilst they may be labeled are actually significantly offside on what they physically contain versus what they're labeled to say is containing. And that's basically labeling 101 from a compliance perspective. What we learned very early on in Canada was that the regulator allowed for certain deviances on cannabinoid content, as an example, whether it be CBD or THC or both. But there's strict guidelines under which you can operate in terms of whether that be offside. So if you're saying something has got 10 milligrams of THC in it, it can't be 28 milligrams of THC. And it also also can't be 1 milligram of THC in it. And I think that's a very important conversation, because people today are, going about high streets in the UK saying, I'm getting 25 milligrams of CBD because that's what it says on the label. When in fact, we know now for a fact that in some cases it's maybe 2 or 3 milligrams of CBD. So you're not really getting what you're paying for.
Or none whatsoever sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. Or you might be getting something completely different than what you're paying for, or you think you're getting. You may be using a CBD product, but it may contain levels of THC that might result in you being impaired. So, these are very significant conversations, and they have a lot of impact on regulators like the Food Safety Agency that looks at this and says, hold on a second, we need to change the way that we go about doing this, and we cannot allow certain things to go on. And at Materia, we've seen this quite a bit in Canada, and we were able to preempt this and ensure that any of our suppliers, any of our manufacturers, and any of our products that go out are going to meet those guidelines and are going to actually be what they say they are.
And on that point, I've got a question around how that labeling relates to flower products. So I know, for instance, in Canada, people can buy a strain online from the Ontario Cannabis Store, and they get sent a pot, and the pot has a certain percentage of THC in, which could vary from 15 to 25%. And you occasionally see angry posters on Reddit saying, I wanted the high THC, but I got a fairly low THC version. How do people do the testing for the flower? Is it by every bud? Because that seems like it would be non-economical. Or if it's from every batch, presumably the variance is such that what you get on the jar wouldn't be the same as what's happening inside it. I'll be frank, I'm not sure if that labeling, to me, seems like it would be physically possible to get right without such a high burden of testing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it's down at a batch level in Canada so far. And again, I mean, you're right. It's hard to look at, variances from bud to bud, but I mean, at least buds within a batch will give you some sort of certainty in terms of the overall content being within the variable limits. And I mean, this is something that Health Canada has, again, landed on after quite a bit of research and quite a bit of consultation with industry, as well as with cultivators of these products, to make sure that they're able to get a balance right between what customers want and demand and expect versus what growers or cultivators can actually physically put out.
Now, changing tack somewhat, there have been a small handful of instances where Canadian cultivators have been sanctioned for conducting unlicensed grows. What impact do you think that has on other Canadian firms looking to operate perhaps internationally in the future? And what do you think the wider impact is on the cannabis industry as a whole?
Yeah, look, the responsibility is certainly on the Canadian cannabis industry to demonstrate that we're operating in a responsible fashion internationally. The world looks to Canada today for our cannabis policies, our regulations, our products, and our companies, whether it be on the consumer side, whether it be on a governmental side, whether it be on a patient side, or whether it be, quite simply from just international trade. And so, there is a great deal of responsibility that's placed on companies. I think that companies that are operating internationally are doing so by and large in a very responsible fashion. And I think if you look at countries like Germany and the UK that have looked at making European Union GMP condition before which you can import products from Canada, it's probably it's a very high bar, and that's the reason there's only about maybe 6 or 7 companies that fall within that bar. But if you look at those 6 and 7 companies and players out of Canada that have been exporting for quite some time, I think they've all done so in a very responsible fashion. The thing about European Union GMP is most people should appreciate is it comes with a great deal of scrutiny around companies and how they operate and how they cultivate and some of their business procedures. And I think that as a measure and a barrier is fairly important. But even outside of that, I think, you look at the recent instance. I mean, there was a company in Canada that was exporting products into Denmark, and there's certainly been the Danish regulator has been, caught off guard to some extent to try and prevent damage from occurring in the Danish system as a result of this company in Canada that was supplying products to them. So I think there's a great deal of onus, there's a great deal of responsibility. Unfortunately, there are bad actors in the space. I mean, there hasn't been one incident in the last week, I think there's been, a number of incidents over the past years involving quite a few companies in the cannabis space that have been involved in, and have had a negative sort of opinion about them so far. The fact that the industry hasn't matured to a level, I mean, this is indicative of that to a certain extent, but certainly companies that have been operating on a European Union GMP perspective and that are exporting in significant volumes to Europe have demonstrated that they can meet those guidelines and those criteria, and there aren't as much of a concern with them as perhaps some of the newer, smaller players. But it's absolutely incumbent on the Canadian cannabis industry to demonstrate worldwide that we can operate in a responsible fashion, and I don't think we've done that to the best of our ability so far.
Thank you very much, Deepak. You've been a pleasure to have on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Where do they go, the smoke rings I blow each night? Oh, what do they do, those circles of blue and white?
Well, listeners, hope you enjoyed hearing a lot of Deepak and a little of us. And if you did find yourself nodding along at the podcast, please feel free to like, share, subscribe, and even leave a nice review.
Phantom parade of love.
Mm-hmm.